My name is Christian Barrett. For the past 2 years, I've put out monthly episodes of a video podcast called Creaky Footsteps, a casual tour of various supposedly haunted houses in my general geographical area, the eastern part of South Carolina. It's consisted of little more than me shooting some footage of an abandoned house somewhere and narrating it with text based on dubious local legends, some of which I must admit I created myself to bolster my content. I began to get more and more subscribers over the course of the podcast, though I was never more than a one-man operation. For the second anniversary episode, I decided to do something a little more ambitious. Last Friday night, I got off work at my small IT company in Charleston, and after grabbing a quick dinner, I started driving north. And in 90 minutes I'd crossed the state line. In another 2 hours I'd entered a part of North Carolina I'd never been to and was wholly unfamiliar with. My destination was the town of Lenoir on Onslow Bay. The town was considered the shame of Pamlico County, if not the state itself. It was a suffering backwater, connected to civilization only by rural Route 78, called Loon's Neck Road. Once, long ago, it had received cargo boats at its rundown docks, but that had stopped in the 70s. The town had less than 1,000 people left, and in fact it had become the largest incorporated area with the fewest citizens in all of North Carolina. Every part of it had fallen into neglect, judging from the few photos I'd seen. Not helping matters was a book published by some hack in the late 90s called The Town with Many Eyes, a collection of allegedly true campfire tales ascribing all sorts of supernatural upheaval to the place. I'd never read it. It was only because the town had developed such a reputation, in fact, that I had refrained for so long from doing some sort of episode of the podcast there. It almost seemed too obvious. I was only 30 minutes away from Lenoir, and I'd begun to look for signs to Loon's Neck Road, when my cell phone rang on the seat beside me. When I said hello, I was greeted by a voice I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Piero Corso, an historian. He said he didn't know me, but he'd heard I put out a show about haunted places, and he'd seen on my website that my next episode, to be released in 2 days, was going to be about Lenoir. I confirmed this information, a little confused about how this person had gotten my phone number, but it didn't occur to me just then to ask. This man, Piero Corso, spoke to me very plainly and directly, in a flat and entirely unemotional voice. He asked me to please not go to Lenoir. Not at all, for it could be very dangerous to me. His tone was so serious I almost laughed. It was so disorienting. When I asked him what he meant, he said he wasn't at liberty to explain, but he had no stake in what happened to me beyond wanting to warn me or anyone with me that something was going on in Lenoir that was a threat to anyone inside the town. I was at a total loss. I told him I was, in fact, headed there at that moment, and there was a long silence on the line. When this man spoke again, he reaffirmed to me that this was a terrible mistake. I asked him to back up and explain from the beginning how he had come to call me, but suddenly the line went dead. He'd hung up on me. I lowered the phone from my ear and focused on the long, dark road ahead of me, trying to replay the brief conversation in my head while navigating by the light of my high beams. The area was growing more hilly, and there were still some patches of snow and ice on the road from a light dusting the night before. At last I felt I had to simply slow down to about 30 miles per hour just to process everything more easily. There had been a certain familiarity to Corso's name and something about the way he spoke. If he was a nutcase, he was completely convincing. I wish there had been some inkling of hysteria in his voice, but there had been none. I stopped for gas at a place called Morton's, and I walked to the edge of the tarmac just to clear my head. I checked Corso's number and dialed it. The connection was terrible, but there was no answer anyway. To make myself feel better, I then walked up to the cashier's window and asked the man there directions to Lenore, which I didn't really need. I just wanted to know if he'd come out with some superstitious nonsense. He didn't. I asked him specifically if he'd ever heard anything strange about the place. He hadn't. I got back in my car and drove on. Soon I saw the first mention of Lenore. The word was printed alone on a small brown metallic sign. It said only how many miles away it was. Steering with one hand again, I placed a call to my wife. She picked up on the first ring. I asked her if she'd given my name and number to someone named Piero Corso, and she said no, so I asked her to do a quick search of the internet for him. She'd have to call me back a little later. She was visiting relatives in New York, and when I told her where I was headed, she surprised me by telling me she was worried. She'd read some things about Lenore in the past and wasn't crazy about the idea of me going there alone at night with a video camera. I told her I'd be fine. I was on Loon's Neck Road in 20 more minutes. It truly turned out to be a seemingly endless country drive, bending away from the ocean with nothing but depleted fields and marshland on either side. No cars seemed to come from the other direction, and no one was behind me. A sign even smaller than the first one I'd seen let me know I'd reached my destination. Again, there was just that one word, Lenore. I entered on the town's south side, which looked like it once housed the industrial district. There was a collection of decaying brick buildings, most of them unmarked. A couple with signs that looked like they were at least 50 or 60 years old. Only one streetlight in 3 was working. Not having any specific map of the town, I cruised slowly east toward Onslow Bay, which I reached in about 5 minutes. Beyond 2 or 3 abandoned hotels, more like flop houses by the look of them, and a series of dark warehouses, there was a port. 2 piers jutted out into a narrow part of the bay. There were no boats in sight. I couldn't tell if a single one had been here recently. It certainly didn't look like it. I bypassed Lenore's main street, which was the usual collection of shuttered shops, and got into more of the residential part of town. I went past something called W. Williams Elementary School, and there was a stretch of cheap row houses that went on for more than a mile. I started to worry that I hadn't planned enough and that the building I was looking for would take me forever to find. But I looked across it soon enough. Off Tower View Road, there was Mason, and that dead-ended at St. Anesia's Church. This place was the main reason I'd come to Lenore. I parked on the side of the road in my choice of spots, since there was nothing near the church but an empty field and some cracked tennis courts surrounded by a chain-link fence. I took my video camera and my heavy-duty flashlight and got out of the car into the cold. Looking around me, I saw no one, and it occurred to me I hadn't seen a single soul on the streets since I'd gotten there. 2 cars had driven past me, and that was it. This was on a Friday night at a little past 11:30. The church was dark, not a single light visible from outside it, but that was expected, since the place had been shut down years before. I walked up the steps to the front doors, expecting them to be locked, but they weren't. I looked briefly behind me to see if anyone was watching, but of course there was no one. I pushed the right-hand door inward just a bit. It was incredibly heavy, but it opened with no resistance. I decided to go all the way in and close it behind me, turning my flashlight on since there was no electricity. There I was, inside St. Anesia's Church, which had made Lenore briefly infamous in 2004. Instead of tearing it down, they'd merely stopped using it. But apparently the building was going to remain at the end of this little road forever. Half of the pews had been ripped out, exactly half, just the ones on the left side. There was no longer any altar, no adornments of any kind. The stained glass windows were intact, but there wasn't much else to signify that services had once been performed here. There was a tiny bit of light after all, and seeing it nearly sent me back out into the cold for the shock of spotting it. On the filthy floor in the center of the church was a single candle, sitting on what looked like a dinner plate. The candle was thick and had once been fairly tall, but it was wearing down to almost nothing. There was so much burned wax surrounding it that it might have been burning for a day or more. Someone had been here very recently. I shone the beam of the flashlight all round, now paranoid that I was being watched. But it really seemed I was totally alone. I would have normally set my video camera up on its tripod now and shot some video, especially since I had never expected this lucky break of getting inside the church. But I felt I wanted to be out of there fast, so I quickly just got some handheld shots of the interior so I could overdub the narration later. Here, I would say, right here, the 6 children were found in 2004. None of them yet harmed, but drugged and then literally taped down to the floor in the aisle between the pews, taped down clumsily with the electrical tape so they wouldn't be able to move if they awoke. On each of their palms, someone had painted a symbol of an eye divided in two, a clear gap between the two halves. Inside that gap was a 6-pointed star. In the back of the church, Father Pat Tarkenton was found, stabbed to death. Parked outside had been the van that had been driven by the woman who'd abducted the children 6 hours before from a nearby playground. This was the culminating incident in a chain of recent cult practices that had brought a sinister aura to Lenore, which would stick forever. Vandalism had occurred, assaults, arrests, yet absolutely no one ever admitted involvement with any cult until 2004. The woman who'd abducted the children had apparently agreed to cooperate with the authorities, but 2 days after her arrest, she'd been found in her cell, dead of a heart attack, at age 26. Far stranger still was the fate of the children who had been taken and branded with black ink. They were all dead by 2009, all of them, of various causes. 2 car accidents, 2 cases of leukemia, and a brother and sister both dead in a fire. And so Lenore, already a place people didn't like to talk about, entered the popular imagination as a cult town. Its population had dropped 50% in the last 10 years. There was just enough information about what had happened to give rise to endless speculation, and not anywhere near enough facts to really know what was going on here, if anything at all. I got my footage of the interior of St. Anesius Church and turned to leave. I shone the flashlight against the doors and saw what had been painted on them in letters 4 feet high. It was a date, 12/19/10. This was today's date. Wanting to be out of there right now, I opened the doors a crack to peer out onto the street. The moment I was sure no one was out there, I left the church, moving briskly down the steps. I didn't feel safe again until I was inside my car. I forced a little laugh out just to make myself feel ridiculous for locking the door. I started the car right up and pulled away from the curb. I wasn't leaving, though, not just yet. I didn't want to leave until I had a little more footage of the town, and after I'd confirmed that the rumors about Lenore's lack of cell phone reception were completely true, I had to take care of one last thing. I drove past the tiny post office and spotted a payphone beside it. I parked again and called my wife. She seemed relieved to hear from me. She said the reason the name Piero Corso had sounded familiar to me was because it was connected to the case of Ralph Broglie. Ralph Broglie had been a prisoner in maximum security in Montreal and had died during an apparent botched exorcism. Piero Corso, who is now a wanted man in Canada, had been the name of the man who'd hired the pair of exorcists who'd accidentally or otherwise drowned Broglie in an empty part of the prison after they'd been smuggled into the building somehow. I had no choice but to tell my wife that, yes, if it was the same Piero Corso, I had spoken to him that night. But I wouldn't give her the details yet. I assured her I was leaving Lenore and I was on my way back home, and that nothing out of the ordinary had happened here, and that I would explain everything later. Back in the car, I cruised slowly toward the north side of town, pointing the camera through the windshield as I drove just to get whatever very rough shots I could. I wasn't going to have the fortitude to do my usual 2 or 3 remotes here. I would come back later, maybe, during the day, with a friend, but most likely my adventure in Lenore was over. Still, I saw no one on the streets, until in the north part of town, which was entirely residential, I could make out 2 people running across the road ahead of me, far in the distance, from one side of the street to the other, and then out of sight. About 2 minutes later, a car came in the other direction, and it visibly slowed as it approached me. I actually sped up, very unnerved. I glanced to my left as I passed the car, but I couldn't see inside it. When I saw that it had stopped completely, I took an immediate right turn and sped up. The car didn't follow. Another left took me into a more wooded area. I didn't want to turn around, so I kept going. I realized I could very easily get lost here. I tried taking one more right and found myself in a very quiet part of town, all single-story houses and a private school. A cemetery came up on my left, or more accurately, a gravel path that led back into it, and I assumed this was Crown Point Cemetery, a photo of which adorned the cover of The Town with Many Eyes. It was the one story in the book I was familiar with, having read it on some website. This one actually had a little validity to it, since there were newspaper sources to back it up. I turned into the cemetery, which had no gate. I bumped along the gravel very slowly, going past wildly uneven rows of very old tombstones, some dating back to the Revolutionary War, probably. The cemetery would have been quite ugly during the day, and was more so at night, pockmarked with random rises and depressions, scraggly weeds, unkept grass. The path went back about 1/4 of a mile and stopped abruptly. The tombstone I wanted to look at was reportedly taller than all the others. Otherwise, I never would have found it. It was set about 20 feet off the path. There was nothing remarkable about its design, only its inscription, supposedly. I stopped the car in the middle of the path, killed the headlights, grabbed my flashlight and the camera again, and got out. I felt confident no one was around. The tombstone belonged to a man named Curtis Palliser, the man who had founded Lenore. As soon as the beam of my flashlight fell across the front of the stone, I saw that in this one case, legend was actually truth. I read the inscription twice before I took some shots of it for the episode. Keeping in mind that Palliser had been an importer of impeccable reputation during his life, with not a single whisper of any wrongdoing, this is what that inscription read: God pity his soul, and forgive him for his wretched deeds, and let men be watchful that he does not stir from his slumber beside the beast. Born 1780, died 1867. That was it. Palliser's original tombstone had been secretly replaced by persons unknown sometime in the 7th winter after his death, and for some reason, this one had stayed. Since then, no one had ever uncovered a single plausible story from the past to bring shame to his name, not one. Yet there was the inscription, and no protest enough from anyone to remove it. Back inside the car, I tried to find a weather report, but every station seemed to be speaking from under a blanket of static, and I gave up. I snaked down a road where more working-class houses stood. There was one whose front door was wide open, leading into total darkness, and one where a Doberman Pinscher stalked across the lawn slowly, tracking my car until I was out of sight. I turned onto Kingman Street. My headlights picked out something in the road up ahead. It was a body. I pulled over and left the engine running and ran out. I knew the man was dead already. The trail of dark blood that ran from him flowed all the way to the side of the road. He was face down on the pavement. I turned him over and saw that he had been stabbed at least a dozen times. He was about 50 years old, his eyes open and staring. Kingman was an unusually dark road. Houses were on each side. I let the man go and ran toward the first one I saw. There was a single light on inside, a feeble one. So I knocked on the door several times, trying not to make it too forceful lest I scare the people in there. There was no answer, and the windows on the lower floor were just too high for me to see into. I left that house and ran across a driveway to the next one. There didn't seem to be much life in there either, but I had to try. Again, though, there was no answer to my constant knocking. The fact that there were 2 cars in the driveway told me there must be someone home. So I moved to my left and raised myself on my toes to see into the living room. What I saw there sent me around to the back of the house in a frantic attempt to find some way in. I climbed over a short chain-link fence and crossed a small back lawn to a large porch where a grill sat uncovered. The back door was ajar. Without thinking, I went right in. I found myself in the kitchen of this house. There were lights on in here. I saw dishes in the sink. Beyond that was the living room and another body. It was a woman sitting in a rocking chair. On the TV set in the corner, a DVD menu for a documentary about the Civil War played on and on. The woman had no visible wounds, but I have never seen a look of terror like I saw on her face, which had gone almost utterly white. Her head was cocked at a strange angle, strands of her hair thankfully obscuring her eyes. I didn't know how long she had been dead. There was something on the wall behind the television, something scrawled there in what looked like black paint. From a distance it might have passed for an accidental blotch, but looking a little closer it was obvious that I was looking at a crude drawing of a dead tree. It was meant to be little more than a silhouette. It stretched from about chest level, almost all the way to the ceiling. That was it, nothing more. I looked for a phone there only briefly. When I didn't see one in the living room or the kitchen, I ran out the back door again, frightened of spending a single moment more in that house. But outside was no better, for the feeling of being watched was constant now. I tore across the backyard, nearly snapping my foot when it came to rest on the edge of a rabbit hole. I climbed over the rear section of chain-link fence onto the next property. There were more lights on in the house now in front of me than any other I had seen. There was no back porch, just a back door, and I turned the knob before even knocking. It was open. Just like the house across the way, the kitchen was the first room you entered. Everything seemed very neat and clean. I called out for someone, but there was no response. The contents of the living room suggested someone here was moving in or out soon, lots of things in crates and boxes. The television set was dark. I called out again. No answer. The sense that something was horribly wrong here as well sunk into me quickly. almost a physical sensation in my chest and my lungs. I went to the staircase in the corner of the room. It was unlit. I found the courage to start up the stairs, but I couldn't bring myself to call out any longer. It scared me too much to make any sound at all. Even my quiet footsteps on the stairs as I climbed them was too much. I stopped going up when I saw a very small streak of paint, black paint, that had smudged a corner of the wall at the staircase's blind turn. Sensing how dark it was up there, I turned on my flashlight. And then I just stood on the third step with my back to the wall, trying to control my breathing for a full minute. There was no way I could go up the rest of those stairs. But it was at about that point that I became someone different, someone almost unrecognizable to myself. Some bizarre, primal need to see what was up there took over despite all my common sense. It was almost an out-of-body experience. The belief that I was so close to death, my own death, actually pushed me closer towards it. I turned the blind corner and there were 6 more steps ahead of me. I had to use the flashlight now to see. The beam shone up into the hallway above, and before I even took one more step, it caught a bare human foot just beyond the top one. The rest of the body was hidden from view behind the near wall. When I got to the top of the staircase, the rest of the image came into view. It was a woman lying face down. She'd been moving toward the bathroom at the end of the hall when she'd fallen from her wounds, or maybe was pinned down while they were inflicted. I turned the flashlight slowly to my left and toward the bedroom that she'd obviously come from. The door was open. I walked toward it. It was pitch black in there. I no longer cared or even minded. My reality had become so nightmarish that I was treating it all like a nightmare. Something unreal. I crossed the threshold into the room. This time the killer, or killers, had painted the tree above the headboard of the bed. There had been a terrible struggle. A lamp had been knocked over, the sheets were completely off the bed. The headboard itself had been dislodged and broken. In the end, the man inside the bedroom had been overwhelmed. He was in one corner of the room, below an open window. There was more black paint there. The date had once again been written in rapid and almost illegible slashes. Through the window I could see the upper windows of the house beside this one. All this was obscured by a foul odor of something burning, or having been burned. It was stronger near the corner, where the body lay. I trained the flashlight there again, longer this time, and moved closer. What I beheld was an impossibility. The dead man's skin had been charred almost black from head to toe, including his hands and his bare feet, but his clothing was not even partially singed. He wore a Tennessee Titans sweatshirt and gray sweatpants. None of it was damaged, yet he himself, as if the victim of some kind of spell, had been utterly immolated. No stab wounds, none. Only some freakish burning. Something else. He'd been holding something in his right hand when he died, still clutching it tightly. It was a knife, but one unlike I had ever seen. Double-bladed, almost as if the blades were fangs, and thick, 8 inches or more in length, with a wooden, carefully carved handle. I supposed he had meant to use it, but never got the chance. I did not even run out of the house. I went down the stairs with one more glance at the dead woman and walked out the front door as if I lived there. and I crouched on the lawn and looked off at the body that was still lying in the middle of the road. I wanted to lie down in the grass and close my eyes and never wake up. But I forced myself back onto my feet and toward the road. My car was still idling, I saw. I'd left it running all this time. No one had taken it. No one had touched it. I got in and threw the car into reverse. I turned completely around and started driving back the way I had come, but my mind had no conception of where I really was. I couldn't focus at all, so I drove blind, forgetting completely the turns I had made to get there. I just drove. On the fronts of 2 consecutive houses on Windbale Lane, images of trees had been scrawled. It slowly came to me in little pieces, the rumor and gossip I hadn't processed correctly before. 2 cults. Not just one, the newspapers used to claim. And not only were they not aligned, some said they were at war with one another. All nonsense, all of it, none of it proven, none of it understood. The sort of urban legend that took hold in a quiet town, but eventually died. I finally saw a real living being in Lenore well past midnight. 1 street over from the silent bay, someone was sitting on a swing in a children's playground beside a daycare center. At first I just saw a shape and then the outlines of a face under the glow of a weak nearby streetlight. I pulled the car over to the curb and killed the engine. The person sitting on the swing didn't even look in my direction. I got out of the car and just stood for a moment 50 feet away from the playground. The man and I, for I could see now that it was a man, looked at each other. I finally dared to approach him, crossing the sidewalk and moving past a jungle gym. I told him I needed some help. He looked at me blankly as I walked towards him, not responding. He was a man of middle age, well-dressed. I barely heard him ask me in a low voice if I was Christian Barrett. I stopped. When I asked him if he was Piero Corso, he nodded slowly. I asked him what had happened here. I'm now trying to remember his words as best I can. To my first question, his response was only that Palliser's children had lost, and that tonight the tree would live again. To my question about whether he had called the police and if someone was coming to help, he merely shook his head and said it didn't matter now. I didn't know what to ask next. Before I could ask anything, he stood up from the swing and advised me not to get back in my car, that it was best not to be seen, that I should stay on foot. He said it would be all over soon enough, but I might be able to make it out of town if I wasn't seen. To this he added that he was sorry he was too late in coming here. And then he lifted his right hand to his mouth and put something in it, something very small. And he swallowed it. A second later he collapsed where he stood, all at once as if he had been shot. He emitted a sick cough when he struck the ground. His left leg pounded again and again on the patch of dirt in front of the swing that had been worn away from so many children's feet, and his body twisted as if something were climbing up his spine and he were trying to shake it off. And then suddenly he lay still, dead on the ground before me. I did not touch him, did not try to revive him. I knew it was useless. My decision as to where to go next was made for me when I looked down the street. In the pool of yellow light thrown by a street lamp 100 yards away, I saw 2 dark figures running in my direction. One of them was holding some long, thin object in its right hand. There would not even be enough time to make it back to my car. So I turned and ran across the playground into the darkness, toward the empty ball field behind it. I made it far further than I thought I could. When my lungs felt like they were going to seize up in the cold, sheer adrenaline took me forward. At no point as I ran across a faded baseball diamond into the woods at the end of the field did I look behind me. Only when I tripped over a heavy stone and slammed into the ground did I stop, roll over, and look through the trees at the stretch I had just crossed. I saw no one. They had given up. Once again I was alone in Lenore. This time I was in a place where no one could see me, and that's where I wanted to stay. I lay on the ground and my face pressed into the frost for a couple of minutes, and then I got to my feet and headed deeper into the woods that bordered the bay. I wasn't sure where I was walking. It didn't seem to matter. It was just enough to be off the streets, out of sight. My mind was working well enough to check my cell phone once again in the futile hope that I'd get a signal. Again, there was nothing. I didn't have my flashlight with me, and the woods were thick even in the middle of winter. I stumbled forward, trying to keep my mind a blank. My night vision brought everything more and more into focus. The stars were perfectly clear above me. They shone enough light that I could make little things out. Initials carved onto a fallen log, an empty soda bottle lying beside a stick shaped like a W. These were the things around me when there came a sound which stopped me. The wind had just risen unexpectedly, colder than ever, when I heard a low moaning that seemed to be coming from ahead and behind. This moaning became something more within seconds. It was as if the earth itself was in pain. It rose, and I looked all around me desperately. Another layer of sound emerged, something I have to describe as a voice, because there's no other way to describe it. Low, angry, and bellowing, one unending cry of rage. It got so loud I had to put my hands over my ears, and I cried out. Maybe 200 feet in front of me, a giant, shrieking mass of darkness was rising toward the sky. Something that was growing rapidly, reaching upwards, dwarfing everything around it. It was a tree, 10 times wider than any other in the woods, and sprouting 1,000, 5,000 branches, sprung up from nothing. As I stood there, screaming, the sound of its rage crushing whatever I could summon, the tree began to shake as it grew and grew, those long branches waving and cracking violently. I remember a bright star suddenly disappearing as the tree's upper reaches blocked it, so high now that within a minute it would scrape the clouds. I felt blood come out of my ears and trickle down each cheek as my eardrums burst. The monster's branches lashed out, and I saw several of them snap off with the force of its deafening quaking, falling to the ground below like people hurling themselves off a high ledge to their deaths. The unearthly roar must have traveled for miles. I felt it seize my spine, and I collapsed to the ground, certain I would be dead in a moment. The tree began to bend to the left and right as if it were trying to rip itself free of the ground. I saw a branch the height of a low airplane begin to descend toward me, finally striking the trees that protected me and snapping in a dozen pieces before falling out of sight. Then, only about 50 feet off the ground, the most awful sight of all. Clinging to the tree that wrenched itself in all directions as if buffeted by a windstorm were human-like creatures that proved to be actual humans, naked and streaked in filth. They were attempting to slither down the tree towards the ground. They were all over the tree, climbing downwards in fits and starts as they could manage, reaching out and grasping the bark with pale hands, adhered to the trunk somehow. Even so, among the dozens of bestial humans born from the tree, I saw 3 or 4 of them flung off, losing their grip and falling into the darkness. One fell from a height so vast it appeared in the sky, tumbling downwards as if from nowhere. I was on my knees, my hands clawing my face, my lungs stripped from shrieking, when everything went mercifully black. The last thing I felt was a single leaf blown by the wind striking the corner of my mouth. Such a minute detail tells me how real it all truly was, so that now, as I sit in the basement of my house writing this down, I have confidence that I am not at all insane. They found me on the side of Loon's Neck Road, 2 miles outside of Lenore. I spent a day in the hospital recovering from my injuries, telling no one my story until it was forced out of me by the police, who consider me a prime suspect in the Lenore murders. There were 15 people killed, an alert reporter discovering that all of them were descendants of Curtis Palliser. The killings were obviously the work of many, of whom they think I may have even been the leader. I told them everything, except what happened in the woods. I don't think they even believed me when I told them that Piero Corso had committed suicide. The memory of his face when he swallowed that pill is what most makes me believe that whatever happens to me is immaterial. The world itself may end soon enough for all I know. Something's been released. Something has grown. There may be no monstrous thing in the woods visible to the human eye, but that doesn't mean anything. The truth was there with what Corso did. Or maybe it'll just be Lenore that's stricken. That's something to hope for. Though when I wake up from my nightmares, it feels more likely that winter won't ever be leaving any of us.